Okay, so now I think it's up to my turn here to start off with this discussion on the optics and photonic simulation in the context of a digital twin. So the people currently involved in my group on the subject are Marie-Louise Schubert and Jan-David Fischbach. And we are very happy to present you some of the work that we have been doing in the past years, actually, in this particular context. So the idea of this presentation today is maybe not particularly to elaborate in full detail what exactly we have been doing here in this particular example, also that we showed before in this digital twin. But the purpose of this presentation is to go a little bit beyond and tell you what are the, let's say, the general approaches that we use actually in order to solve inverse problems in the context of photonic simulations for solar cell applications on the one hand, and on the other hand, to demonstrate, let's say, current techniques and approaches and physical methods, basically, physical effects that one can exploit in order to steer how light propagates inside a solar cell. And for many of these more modern approaches, basically, so these techniques from inverse design are indispensable because they allow us to steer and to control all degrees of freedom that are characterizing the solar cell. And that is very beneficial, actually, now in order to come up with optimal sets of parameters that these solar cells are supposed to have. Yeah. So just as a kind of general introduction also, and then to put us a bit into, let's say, the sort of pipeline of this digital twin, I would just like to stress what is the main purpose. So the main purpose is that we start here with the appreciation that sun is basically emitting a very large amount of photons, so that we would like to harvest and generate electron hole pairs in the solar cell in order to extract power from that. Yeah. The sort of actual solar cells, of course, they're extremely complicated. Yeah, so they are macroscopic devices, as you can easily imagine, also from this entire workflow this digital twin consists of. But for our purpose in this optical simulations, we take one step back and consider a solar cell to a certain extent in a kind of simplified form. And in particular, we are considering it as a spatial distribution of material that is characterized by a dispersive dielectric function that is going to interact actually with light and where light is going to be absorbed. And the main purpose basically is to add supporting structures into this sort of light absorbing material such that on the one hand we have no reflection, so this is like a huge loss channel actually, and on the other hand we have like perfect absorption by the structure such that most of the photons, and of course perfect absorption in the active layer of the solar cell material, such that electron hole pairs are generated, which contribute then to an external current. So in more advanced aspects, also possible reabsorption needs to be considered, in particular with semiconductors with a direct band gap. But I think we are not going to touch up on these things, but nevertheless, this is also a part of light management that we need to consider. So there are a few constraints which set the sort of question here apart from what other problems basically are that we also other directions of our research. And that is we have here a huge spectral domain. Solar light comes as unpolarized, and it also has a kind of low degree of coherence, which we need to consider to somewhat, at least when looking into the design parts. Yeah. And this is the kind of general setting. Yeah. So and now we have to think about how structures could look like that serve this particular purpose. And the light management topic over the years indeed had been experiences multiple steps of evolution, and different approaches have been perceived in order to contribute to the solution of this problem. So while I don't think this is like the ultimate answer, but to me, much of the research goes back to the sort of pioneering work here from Ilya Jablonowicz, and that had been showing back in 1982 already that if you have a textured interface of light absorbing material, so you can enhance the absorption actually by a factor of 4n square, which requires perfect back reflection actually at the backside of the sort of light absorbing material. And also this needs to be like a perfect randomization. So in the limit of a weakly absorbing intrinsic material, you can enhance this light absorption by a suitable Strusen texture up to 4n square. And this is quite an important number, because it really tells you that this is like a kind of limit that you can achieve by a suitable structure that improves actually directly the performance then of solar cells. In the following years, basically a lot of work had been done on really achieving suitable textures that are coming close to that sort of upper limit here. and generally also studying basically how given textures behave when they interact actually with light with these structures. So these textures for a long time, they had been fabricated in a kind of stochastic manner by putting silicon substrates into a weakly acidic solution and then basically by etching down of these materials. These textures have been implemented into silicon materials where they have been used then also for the purpose of light management. Maybe the things have changed a little bit, let's say around 2000, 2005, 2010s, maybe so in that sort of domain, because people started to explore how deterministic controls or deterministic means to change the geometry of objects are helpful in order to improve the light management of these structures. And then a lot of nanophotonic and photonic concepts actually have been considered to be integrated into solar cells in order to improve the light management. So this starts with like basic structures such as interference filters, basically that works here on multi-layers interference, but also weak corrugations of light absorbing materials have been used. If this is periodically arranged, then you can excite guided modes in these waveguides. And then you can reach a tremendous enhancement in a very narrow spectral domain. But by suitable mode engineering, actually, you can excite many of these guided modes, and then in average, you also get a very large absorption out there. So people have been also integrating all types of more macroscopic scattering objects into solar cells that basically scatter light into oblique direction such that the probability of absorption of light in the active layer is enhanced. Or people also considering some metallic structures by exploiting plasmonic effects in solar cells, where nevertheless the disadvantage is always that these plasmonic structures also intrinsically absorb light, which requires to overcompensate actually with the absorption enhancement, first of all, these unavoidable losses in these plasmonic structures, which makes it a bit challenging to obtain a net benefit. But at least people have been looking into using these kind of devices in specific cell geometries. There had been more advanced structures also like photonic crystals. Here at the example of an intermediate reflector of a tandem solar cell by exploiting here the ability to perfectly reflect light in a reasonable extended spectral domain, such that more light gets absorbed in the sort of top reflector of a solar cell and less light in the button reflector, and also diffuse or diffract light actually into structure. This sort of ability to diffuse and diffract or scatter light into desired direction, this was particularly also exploited with disordered structures that people have been being able to fabricate also on large scales over extended surfaces, which I show later also as an example of a very contemporary modern type of photonic structure that can be used for the light management. Besides the sort of spatial approaches, there also have been a lot of spectral approaches for light management, such as down and or up conversion. Also photon recycling has been considered, and luminescent concentrators. These aspects basically one can always exploit in order to improve the light management. So nevertheless, most of the structures that I'm going to discuss then in the following are going to revolve around the spatial degrees of freedom, meaning basically that we want to control how light propagates in solar cells in order to enhance the probability of absorption. So this sort of full domain basically of light management basically requires us to solve Maxwell's equations, which I do not show here in full glory, but instead only show this picture of James Clerk Maxwell as illustration for the equation, considering that out there it's like 35 or 37 degrees here. So we keep this a bit more light, but it's this sort of framework basically that we have to solve in order to study how light interacts really with these structured materials that have typical length scales that compare to the wavelengths and that cannot be described anymore with simplified treatments. So in our work, we have been relying or we have been exploiting actually a lot of developments that took place in the context of numerical techniques that solve Maxwell's equations. So for different geometries, for different settings, and for different purposes. And by now we have a gigantic large number of tools actually available so that allow us to solve Maxwell's equations quite reliable. So there are a lot of acronyms behind here, which I will not discuss in detail because I would also say by now this is more a standard type of technical ability and expertise to solve Maxwell's equation. I would just like to highlight here that this finite element method is a bit more discussed in detail afterwards in this presentation from Sven Burger, and how this can be used then also for the purpose of light management. But this is like the key ability that we need to have. So we need to solve Maxwell's equation in order to do meaningful research in the context of light management and optics and photonics for a digital twin. But as we also tried to elaborate on this in this introductory talk, so nowadays it's not just about being able to solve a forward problem, but it's particularly important that we try to solve the inverse problem, and that is to optimize and to tailor all degrees of freedom that we have in order to hit a particular objective function. And to come, let's say, to a bit of an overview of what type of techniques we use in this context, we just have to appreciate how such a sort of inverse design cycle is actually working, because it starts with a kind of suitable parameterization of our geometry that we are going to use for our solar cell. And this parameterization here is in this figure illustrated as really as a kind of bunch of geometrical parameters that describe the system. But this is not necessary actually per se. So we can also use techniques from the field of machine learning, where we rather use parameters in a hyperspace or latent space, so that basically all possible geometries that are accessible by a certain fabrication techniques, without really requiring that there's a physical meaning of these parameters that exist in our latent space. So you can think of all types of parameterizations. So as long as this sort of parameterization translates to a given geometry, so everything is fine with this type of approach. And then in this sort of inverse problem, basically, we start to use our Maxwell solver of preference in order to calculate this electromagnetic field everywhere in space, and also for the solar cell in particular, for a wide range of incidence condition, depending on the wavelengths and or also the wavelengths. And from all this response that we calculate there, we basically have to evaluate an objective function, which we will see exist in different versions. But a low-hanging or direct objective function would be like you would like to reduce like the reflection as good as possible over all spectral domains, or you would like to enhance the short circuit current or the integrated absorption rate basically as much as possible by a suitable structure. But this objective function should be like a single number that tells you how good a certain design is going to work for the specific purpose of this light management. And it quantifies basically the goodness of a given structure. And then the actual optimization algorithm basically does that based on all the previously sampled parameters in our parameter space, combined with the associated objective functions. The purpose is to come up with a new set of parameters that presumably maximizes the objective function according to our desire. And then this iteration loop here is basically closed. And we have a new set that we are going to consider in our Maxwell solver, iterate basically here around in order to come up with a suitable number of parameters. This was already discussed before. I think we have a few constraints here. So first of all, we have only limited time available to find an optimal design, and also limited resources when it comes to computational power. So we would like to have a parameterization that is adapted to a certain fabrication methodology, so that we do not optimize a sample and then we go to our experimental colleagues and ask them how they should look like, or we ask them, please fabricate these samples, and then they have no idea how to do this. So ideally, this optimization should take place actually within the parameters that characterize the fabrication process. And another constraint, this is maybe more philosophical constraint, but ideally we would like to have this without human intervention, in a sense that we would like to be open also for solutions that we have not foreseen based on our intuition that was developed from looking into the systems for many, many times. And the way we need to solve that sort of optimization problem so can be done in many different ways. And the easiest example, of course, is just the pure parameter. Yeah. So this is, for example, demonstrated here in this sort of structure that enhance absorption in a silicon thin film solar cell by tweaking here a set of parameters. As you can see, this work has been done quite some time ago, but I think it's a good demonstration for exactly this sort of technique of a parameter sweep. Because all what you technically need to do is just to change your parameters in a reasonable range that leads you to a hope, let's say, for an improvement. and then just pick up the example that is maximizing your objective function. In this case, this was here the absorption enhancement integrated over a large spectral domain. And why this is like a feasible approach. So for very low dimensional problems, like in this case, we have like 2 or at most 3 parameters, then this is still a viable option because you can, let's say, you sample every degree of freedom basically by 10 discrete points, and then you can make an interpolation in this sort of objective space. And then you need 100 or 1000 full wave simulations, depending on whether you have 2 or 3 parameters. And this is a number of simulations maybe that is feasible to do on available computing infrastructure. But of course, this is not something that is scalable because this is something that people call like the curse of dimensionality. Because if you have instead of 3 parameters, but you have 6 or 7 parameters, which is just slightly more, but then you can easily appreciate that you have millions or tens of millions of full wave simulations, which is not possible with any meaningful computational techniques. So that's why we have to develop more suitable, more adapted approaches actually to solve this inverse problem without this exhaustive need for an indefinite large number of function evaluations. And here actually, so multiple techniques have been used and are used also in a broader context of the digital twin here. So depending on the number of parameters that characterize our problem. So for medium dimensional problem, I mean, this was also discussed before a little bit. So for this medium number of parameters, there is still hope, let's say, to reach like a global optimum. Yeah. So global optimum means that you would like to optimize really all these parameters at once, and you would like to get globally the best solutions out of this. So this is still possible for this intermediate number of parameters, basically by excluding ranges or parameter spaces that are unlikely to give you a global maximum. So those ranges basically you're not going to go into sample, but you concentrate your sampling strategy to those domains where there's the highest probability actually to reach the type of global optimum. And this works nice, but it works only for a reasonable number of parameters. So for these very high dimensional problems actually, and now we can speak maybe up to a 10 to the power x parameters. This x can be in the order of 6 or 7. So this sort of global optimum will be found, but then only local gradient-based optimization techniques are feasible. And here a key aspect is that of the so-called adjoint simulations, where in essence we can do 2 full wave simulations. So one of the forward problem, and the second is the so-called adjoint problem. So we can do these 2 full wave simulations in order to obtain the gradients of the objective functions with respect to all degrees of freedoms. Yeah. And this is quite powerful then to start like local gradient-based optimization, then using also various filtering techniques. We can also express constraints and experimental details. And all these aspects are usually come together in techniques called topology optimization, which is then usually the weapon of choice if you have a direct partial differential equation that describes the problem. So then you solve this partial differential equation once, and you also solve the adjoint problem, and then you have this, so this is gradient-based approach. A last aspect that was also already mentioned before is that of automatic differentiation. So here we basically formulate scientific software such a way that all basic elementary steps are differentiably formulated. And then in essence, we can apply this chain rule and these machine learning frameworks in order to get these gradients by applying a local inverse design technique. Yeah. These are the most promising approaches that people use in the context also of these optics simulations that can be used then for this digital twin. And the choice of methods so depends a bit on the specific problem at hand, because not all of these techniques are suitable for exactly the same problem, but some are more preferable than the other. Yeah, and this is what I try to do. I have to see how far I come here because I see my time is running up. But I try to illustrate a little bit how these techniques are working and how we can apply them in the context of optimized light management for solar cells. So to start basically with the sort of Bayesian optimization that can be used then for the sort of intermediate number of problems, I would just like to highlight here this idea. This is actually something that we did together with Sven Borger, also that will speak afterwards. And maybe he also has some more details, but this actually I'm not so fully sure. So in the Bayesian optimization, the idea is that you have your objective function, which is unknown. Yeah, so this objective function is here indicated in this dashed line. Here, just as an example of one-dimensional parameter space, but this is easily extrapolatable then also to higher dimensional problems. And what you start with is that you sample your objective function at a few discrete points. And here also you have gradient information, so you know the value of this objective function and the gradient of this objective function at a particular point in this parameter space, which is going to constrain the possible shape this entire objective function is going to look like. And then we basically apply a kind of Gaussian process, which provides a stochastic process, basically, which predicts the possible behavior of this objective function, depending also on some hyperparameters, such that this objective function is going to be constrained by the function values and the derivatives of this function values that we know at these sort of discrete sampling points. So you can do from that basically a prediction of a mean value prediction and also a standard deviation. And from these quantities, basically, you can predict the expected improvement, meaning this is a scalar valued function that tells you which point in parameter space you should sample best or next in order to get the largest knowledge basically about the underlying behavior of this objective function. And then this is something that you can do straightforward because you're just going to sample your objective function at this point as next. So then you have been constraining this, and then you repeat basically the cycle. So you calculate again this sort of expected improvement, and then you're going to constrain your objective function further and further with a rather small number of function evaluations. And this is then something that is perfectly suitable so for mid-sized problem, as I mentioned, up to 50 degrees of freedom. And we can use this to identify really global optimum. And the way it's described here, we can use this also for reconstructing the sort of objective function in full glory everywhere in parameter space. The way one can apply this is twofold. So one of them is directly shown here in this kind of absorption enhancement. Or in this case, you wanted to suppress reflectivity from this sort of thin film absorber here with a kind of structured element on top of. And the structure element has here characterized by 5 different degrees of freedom. And then these 5 different degrees of freedom have been optimized in a finite number of simulations such that we want to reduce this reflectivity at some discrete wavelengths. And this Bayesian optimization can be seen here works very well when compared to other approaches that would apply equally to the same type of problem. However, these sort of deterministic structures, I think they have to a certain extent a problem, so that they always require this top-down nanofabrication techniques for their realization, which makes it in the context of solar cells also unreasonable to be of use in the long run, because self-assembly structures that can be fabricated on large scales on short notice are more likely to be a viable solution in the long run. And that's why I would like to shift gears slightly, and I would demonstrate the applicability of the sort of Bayesian optimization framework to structures that have been fabricated with bottom-up self-assembly techniques, which gives rise to this disordered metasurfaces where a correlated disorder exists, and which are very useful actually for light management on large scales. Just to introduce a little bit also the sort of experimental procedure is, so we start here with the sort of solar cell substrate. We're going to have this titanium dioxide layer here, and we have a slightly charged layer of this alumina. And so because the purpose here is that we would like to dip coat this into a solution containing PMMA nanospheres, which are also slightly charged. And then because the PMMA sphere and this alumina have an opposite charge, so there is a certain tendency of this PMMA spheres to deposit on the surface just due to electrostatic interaction processes. And moreover, because these spheres here have the same charge, they tend to repel each other, which avoids the agglomeration actually of these spheres on the surface. And the density at which these PMMA spheres can be deposited can actually be controlled by the ionic strength of the liquid in which these PMMA spheres are, which is a kind of single parameter that controls at the end many properties of this sort of self-assembled scattering structures that we are going to end up with. So PMMA is nice, but of course this is not a very good structure actually because it doesn't scattering very strong. So that's why we are using here this kind of tempering technique and then reactive ion etching in order to translate the shape of these sort of PMMA spheres into this titania layer, so which are going to be then disks, so that are arranged on top of the solar cell here actually, and in a kind of hyper-uniform disordered manner, or correlated disordered manner, as it's more precisely called. And these structures can be integrated really into solar cells on large scales in order to improve then here the light management. And then the problem is, so how to simulate actually such systems effectively, and then later how to optimize also these degrees of freedom in these systems. Because this is quite a challenge here for simulation, because we need, I mean, these are strongly scattering objects, and we need to take into account actually a very large number of the surface to have a good representation of the statistical properties of the surface. But on the other hand, that would cost us tremendous computational resources if you would like to do full wave simulations of these large systems. So the idea is, for efficient simulation, we have to squeeze down the size of these domains that we need to consider. But we would still require us to represent the properties of these systems in a sufficiently precise manner. This is a challenge, yeah. So, this is something that we have been solving with the so-called collective coordinate method, which exploits also this idea of obtaining efficient gradient information on the structure factor in order to arrange these particles in a suitable way, so to represent the properties of more macroscopic larger objects. Yeah, and the idea of this approach basically is that we know experimentally, so we can take SEM images. So from that, we know basically what's the spatial distribution of these disks on the surfaces. And the spatial arrangement of these disks is characterized in a global manner by the structure factor, which in essence is just a Fourier transformation of the point distribution, where each point is representing here one of these disks. So we have then actually a random sequential absorption algorithm, so that allows us to predict this process of how these PMMA spheres attach to the surface or detach from the surface, depending on this ionic strength. And by choosing here the right parameters, so we can bring actually large-scale simulations of these spatial patterns in agreement to what we have experimentally access to. And this means that we have like a structural representation of these disk-like patterns. But as I said, so we do not want to do this sort of simulations in a large scale, but we want to squeeze down these structures on shorter length scales, or we want to take smaller unit cells into account that nevertheless have the same properties as these large scale objects. And this is something where this collective coordinate method comes into the game. Because in the collective coordinate method, we're going to consider small supercells, so small of these supercells, but we tweak the spatial location of the individual disks in each unit cell in such a way that the structure factor of the small supercells is in very good agreement with the structure factor of these large supercells. And this is going to be the key then for a very efficient simulation of these large supercell structures, of these large disordered samples. Even so, we have been taking into account only rather small supercells in our simulation. The idea here is basically that we can characterize a given ensemble with the structure factor, which is here the Fourier transformation of this point distribution of these individual disks. Then we define here an objective function where we take basically the difference squared. So this is the L2 norm between the structure factor that we calculate and the target structure factor, which comes either from this experimental results or from this random sequential absorption process of large supercell, of very large surfaces. And then we can use a gradient-based optimization, so we can differentiate this expression here with respect to this position of all these disk structures, such that this structure factor here will be in better agreement with this target structure factor. And this is something that we can do iteratively for a few times. And this allows us then to adjust basically the position of these disks such that this sort of total structure factor is in agreement with this experimentally measured structure factor of small scale unit cells or samples that have been obtained with this random sequential absorption here. And this is just the idea how to illustrate this whole So this is like the structure factor of a large scale sample that have been simulated with this random sequential absorption process. And here we have the same sample, but much smaller, also calculated with this random sequential absorption process without this sort of collective coordinate method. And here we see that this doesn't really look like the sort of structure factor that we have been obtaining here from this large scale sample. And that is just because the spatial domain that we consider in the sort of supercell simulation is too small. And this is illustrated maybe also here. And now the idea is that we tweak these positions of these individual disks. So the starting and the end point is illustrated here with this black and white circles. So we tweak these positions of these disks just slightly, thanks to this efficient gradient information, such that this structure factor actually of this modified sample agrees very well with the structure factor that we have been obtaining here from this large scale sample. And then the idea is that in this case, this sort of 3 × 3 micrometer sample is representing more suitable the properties of these large scale samples, so that we can perform efficient simulations and make reliable predictions. That this works is indeed shown here. So here we have been calculating then with a full wave simulation, so the reflectance spectra of our large supercell, which we can still do with techniques such as finite difference time domain method, but just a single time, and we cannot use this, let's say, really for inverse design or for optimization. So from that kind of function here, we can calculate like the average reflectance current, which is like the current density that is lost due to the reflection of light from the front surface of this meta surface that was put actually on the actual solar cell. And then we can do basically this sort of small scale sample. So 2 × 2 micrometer in this case. This contains only 20 particles. And then we can perform 10 different samples that have all nominally the same disorder. And then we can calculate basically by a different combination of this output here. So we can calculate the sort of reflection current that we expect to be in agreement actually with this sort of reflection current from this large scale sample. The larger the number of samples that we consider here for this ensemble average. And this can be also seen here. So these sort of blue dots are just corresponding to combinations, let's say, of 2 samples, 3 samples, 4 samples out of this ensemble here. And then we can see basically in the course of time for an increasing number of samples, then we reach very reliable, actually, this sort of target response here. However, if we put on top of this sort of collective coordinate method, so then we can reach actually the sort of expectation value of this large scale sample with a much smaller number of simulation. And the uncertainty here is heavily reduced in its spread. And this allows really for the effective simulation of these sort of large scale samples. And then we can do even further. So now we know how to optimize actually the sort of disordered meta surface exactly the way it looks like. And then we can combine actually also different techniques from the field of light management, because on top of this sort of disordered structure, we can also put here a graded anti-reflection coating, which in the following, I assume that there is a gradient between titanium dioxide and alumina, so which gives us an index contrast maybe of 1. So which should further suppress actually back reflection from these kind of structures. And the final system that we are looking at is going to be such structures. So we have these sort of high index disks here, and then this gradient anti-reflection coating. And then this is put on top of a solar cell for an improved light management. And then again, we exactly come back to with our Bayesian optimization framework. Because now in this case, we have 4 parameters that characterize the system. So we have this height of these disks, we have this diameter of these disks, we have the thickness of this anti-reflection coating, and we have here the mean distance that comes from these particles here, which will be controlled at the end of the day by the ionic strengths that will be used to control the deposition of these PMMA nanospheres. And then we can use the sort of Bayesian optimization framework to minimize the sort of reflected current density and to improve with that the absorption. So this is a bit of a busy figure, but this contains basically most of the simulations that were done in order to identify the optimal set of parameters here. Yeah, so thanks to the sort of Bayesian optimization and to this clever sampling of this parameter space. So the final outcome is here. So here is this reflection current, yeah, so that we calculate, and of course we are interested here in this lower range, so which we want to be like as small as possible. And then you see a set of samples here, all characterized by a different mean period, a thickness, a diameter, and a height. And these are then the parameters that characterize these systems. And this leads then to a set of reflection current that are also color coded at the end of the day in this picture. And what you can compare here is basically, besides the sort of full sample, which is shown here, you can also characterize this meta surface alone or this gradient layer alone. And then you can basically identify from that for each of these combinations here an optimal set of parameters so that you can control in order to achieve an efficient light management. Yeah. And this can be also indeed also fabricated and also characterized thanks to the sort of very deterministic type of process that we can put in place here. And the best performing devices are shown here in this figure. So here we have this absorption in our solar cell, and here we have this reflection in our solar cell. The solid line is the simulated results, and the dashed line is coming from the experimental results. This yellow line was the reference data, and then the best sample with this gradient index layer basically is shown here in red. So where we see that we suppress basically here reflection at design wavelengths, which is very good. But this is not fully broadband possible because we also had only a finite English contrast here available, because we have been considering, as I said before, only this titanium dioxide and alumina from which these layers here have been made. So if we use the sort of meta surface sample alone, so indeed we see that we suffer actually here, but we see additional features, resonance features coming up in the spectra here, which result actually from resonances that are induced in these sort of isolated objects here. And only if we combine these two things together, we see actually that we have samples available that have a strongly suppressed reflection over a very large spectral domain. This translates then also in a very good absorption enhancement in the sort of entire spectral domain that is practically relevant for these structures. Yeah, and this is like a very nice combination, so of multiple aspects that people can explore for the purpose of light management, and also a clever computational strategy in order to tweak all parameters that are of interest here. So the last example is I just want to flash this maybe here a little bit. So this goes now into a domain where we have an indefinite large number of parameter space. So in this particular case, we are looking into a lateral tandem solar cell. So that is characterized here by two different subcells which have a certain size. And then the idea is that we would like to put like a diffractive meta surface on top of it in order to spectrally steer one part of the spectral incident light to one of the supercells and the other part of the spectral domain to the other subcell. Yeah. And while these are structures that have been looked at before, usually people have been looking at only into a single of these meta surfaces here, which leads to a rather large angle sensitivity. And in our work, we have been combining here two of these meta surfaces to optimize them also in a heuristic way, such that we get rid basically of this angle dependency here and get rather devices that are angle independent. Yeah, so later you can think about these structures as two meta surfaces, where the first meta surface basically diffracts the light independent of the angle of incidence into the forward direction, and the other meta surface then steers the spectral component on one subcell and on the other subcell. But in essence, this functionality is then also merged in these sort of two meta surfaces that we're going to put in there. And here in this case, it's really like this, so that the sort of height profile at every spatial location, this is a degree of freedom that we need to optimize. And in order to do this, we have been implementing this here with automatic differentiation. So the idea is that we have like a forward tool that describes the properties of these systems. In this particular case, it's like the input. Then we have this sort of meta surface that consists of these two layers. Actually, in between, there's also free space propagation. And then we have, again, free space propagation into the relevant spatial domain. What we have here is like this sort of two spatial domains we are interested in, and light within one spectral domain should go into one of these domains, and light in another spectral domain should go into sort of other spatial domains. So we want to have this separated. And the idea is then that we use like a sin element and a scalar approximation to describe light propagation through the system. We can derive like an objective function, which at the end of the day is just a question of how much light is focused into the sort of different spatial domains depending on the wavelengths. Then we use a gradient descent where we try to differentiate here these sort of phase profiles that we are going to imprint such that this objective function here is going to be maximized. Yeah. And I think this is a very powerful algorithm that allows us for steering this. So this forward code actually has been differentiated then with JAX, and we can optimize then this height profile in an efficient way. And the final results basically are shown here on this slide. So there are two sets of, or actually four sets of simulations. So on the one hand, we consider here 1 versus 2 interfaces, optimized only for a single angle of incidence or for a range of incidence angles. And this is then here the structure. Basically, there's just one metasurface for one angle and for many angles. The color code in this figure here is basically the different angles of incidence that are considered. I think in a range from 0 to 7 degrees, this was here. This spectral range should go here on one of these two lateral tandem cells, and this is the spectral range that should go on the other lateral tandem solar cells with the geometrical designs that was described before. And here we can see so that for a single interface at normal incidence, so this works quite good. So there is this certain spectral domain here where the light goes only into one cell, and then there's nearly no transmission in the other supercell, and vice versa. Yeah, so this light in this spectral domain should go only in the sort of second lateral tandem solar cell, and no light should go into the top lateral tandem solar cell. So this works quite nice, but the sort of angle independence, this doesn't work at all. Yeah. So the algorithm basically doesn't find anything. So here we have a solution basically where this blue I think these blue colors, so they go on one lateral tandem solar cell and this red color on the other lateral tandem solar cell. So if you make this optimized design just for a single angle of incidence, this works quite nice. Yeah, so all the light basically goes to one subcell and the other light goes to the other subcell. But without enforcing this angle independence in design, of course, for variations of angle dependence, then this is not going to look very good. But we can add also this requirement that this device should be angle insensitive. Basically, yeah, so then we can steer the spectral content very nicely with these two metasurfaces to the two lateral tandem solar cells that they have been designed for. This can be also quantified here a little bit. So we can also calculate the current density that is generated in a kind of simplified model from these two lateral tandem solar cells. So there is this sort of reference structure, which is just the current density basically without any light management structure. And then by integrating the sort of metasurfaces, we can improve this current density by roughly a factor of 2. And if you optimize this just for a single angle of incidence or for a very narrow angular range of incidence, of course, we can take the best out of this here. If we make this optimization for a larger range of angle of incidence, so we compromise this peak value, but we benefit actually from that we can increase an improvement of performance here for a larger angular domain quite reliable. And I think this ends this presentation here. I hope I could show you that there are different techniques basically that we can use for the photo management. I think this is the wrong slide. I'm sorry. But I think the idea is that we did a lot of light management basically for the solar cell. So we have been maturing the sort of technology to find efficient solutions actually to this inverse problem. And I hope I could demonstrate this here at a larger number of different examples that illustrate a bit the range of applicability for these different techniques.